Welcome to Prepping for the Studio. If you're a musician or musical artist that wants to learn more about what goes on, how to prepare, or how to make the most out of your studio session, you're in the right place. Prepping for the Studio. Episode 4. Roy and Brian go over how to pick an engineer and a studio that meet your needs. Thanks for joining. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Prepping for the Studio. I am Roy Silverstein, joined by my co-host Brian Schubel.
Hello.
How you doing, Brian?
I'm pretty good, a little warm today, but all good.
Yes, we're here in San Diego at my home base of Rarefied Recording. And yes, it's episode 4, Prepping for the Studio, the podcast for musicians who are new to the studio and want to learn what goes on and how to best prepare and make the most of their time and money. Yeah. Welcome back. You've made it to episode 4. Thank you so far for listening. Hope you've been enjoying it. And we're carrying on here to talk about choosing a studio and tracking engineer and other things in this episode. Because I think last episode we talked about kind of the tracking process and, you know, what all the different ways you can go about it. And this time, now it's, time to figure out, well, where are you going to do this and who's going to do it? Because that's super important. And honestly, more than the studio itself, I think the engineer is even more important.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Wouldn't you say, Brian?
I think so, yeah.
I think if you gave Brian Schubel an SM57 in like someone's practice space, you'd probably beat out a lot of new engineers who were working here or at some like $1 million facility, because you know what you're doing.
I hope.
Yeah.
It's been many years, so something must have stuck.
Yes. The experience trumps a lot of other things. When you're new at recording, or if you're just not very good. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you're in some amazing facility. Like you're probably going to struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And someone who's been doing this for forever, just they have the ears. The ears are developed, and they can actually accomplish quite a bit with very little.
Troubleshoot too.
Yes, and troubleshoot. Keep your session going in a nice way.
Mm-hmm.
But studios are still important though, and we can't ignore them because they have to meet your needs, and there's different aspects to that. But first, I actually want to talk about the different kinds of studios that you may encounter. We have to talk a little bit about studio construction for a second to understand that, because some studios are actually like single room facilities.
Yeah.
Have you ever worked in one like that?
Yeah, I have. It's where the console's in with the musicians. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I actually really like it.
What's good about it?
Well, there's no wall between you. The communication is a lot better. I feel like everything's direct, like really close.
Mm-hmm.
You're out there with them. You're kind of vibing with them. They can see you bobbing your head better. They don't see a glare from the glass. I think you're just more connected is probably the biggest thing.
Right.
The hardest thing is getting sounds, because you kind of have to hear your sounds on a playback.
Right.
You do what you think you're doing, and you crank the speakers up without feedback, and then you record a little bit and you play it back, and that's where you can kind of dial it in better.
Totally. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the pros and cons. You have this direct communication, easy. There's no talking over, talk back, and headphones. Like it's very quick to fix any problems between you and the musicians, or if you're the musician, between you and the engineer. But yeah, the engineer struggles a little more as far as getting sounds, because they're hearing the instruments directly and through the speakers, or they're having to use headphones, which is never as good as listening on speakers, really.
Yeah, the other thing that's pretty cool too is they can see you're working, like you're doing what you need to be doing, so you don't get this like, hey, what's going on?
Uh-huh.
They can't tell what you're doing in the control room.
Yeah.
So in that respect, you're connected as well. They see you're doing your thing. He's over there tuning his guitar.
Uh-huh. And conversations between musicians is better, because sometimes I'll have people in the control room with me doing direct instruments, and then other people in the live room. And if the talkback is not on, sometimes it's not. Like I'm sitting here talking to the musician with me, But the guy in the live room is like, what's going on? What, are you talking about me?
Exactly. Am I fired?
Yeah. I know they're talking about me. I know they are. They're saying all kinds of bad things about me. But, you know, if you're all in one room, then you wouldn't have that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'd say single room studios are not really the norm.
Mm-hmm.
I think you more find that studios have this kind of dual room configuration or dual plus. So, you know, control room, live room, and then the possibilities of isolation booths and stuff like that too. That's a little more typical. And so in that case, you know, you gain the benefit as an engineer of having this better isolation, be able to hear the microphones without hearing the direct sound so much, maybe a tiny bit, if it depends on how loud the instrument is. But yeah, the communication part is trickier now, because now for the engineer to talk to you, they have to use the talkback system. So they're pushing some button and then you're hearing that on headphones.
Yeah.
And they can hear you fine usually because there's a microphone in front of you, most likely. But for you to hear them, it's the talkback, and that can, be a little weird sometimes.
Yep.
Yeah, but it is kind of more the norm. There also can be, isolation booths, I guess in either case. But yeah, usually in a control room, live room situation, there could also be isolation booths, or like at my studio, I have these sound locks that double as isolation booths. Mm-hmm. The sound lock is just like a kind of a passageway between the control room and the live room. Just kind of like you go into like a little space as you go from one to the other. Mm-hmm. And that just helps isolate the sound. But at least at my place, you can also use them as isolation booths.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they double.
Put an amp in there.
Yeah, exactly. Now, it's another common ability of the studios would be to pass signals through the rooms. So, like, you can be a guitar player sitting in the control room with your amp in the live room, just kind of throwing out things that are possible. That's useful,
Totally.
And studios also tend to have some kind of gobos, which are movable sound baffles. Mm-hmm. And that can help create some isolation inside of a large live room. Mm-hmm. Not as good as an isolation booth, but sometimes that's all you need, is just like a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so I have a couple gobos myself in here at Rarefied, which are super useful. So yeah, that's kind of like some studio construction, like the types of studios you're going to encounter out there. And depending on what you're looking to do, that may be a factor. But we have to talk about the quality spectrum. Yes. I think that exists too.
Yeah, and the two rooms are used for different things, so they're going to be treated a little different, which is probably what where you're about to go.
I wasn't going there, but that's a good point. Yes, no, I mean the control room, if we didn't define it for you before, that is where the engineer sits with a lot of equipment usually. The room is designed to be usually acoustically kind of neutral, accurate, if you will. So that what they hear out of the speakers, ideally isn't colored too much. But every studio is a bit different. That's kind of goes to the quality. The live room is, of course, where the musicians would be, and the sound of the live room doesn't have to be neutral. It could actually have quite a sonic stamp on it, potentially. Mm-hmm. That's something to consider, I think, as you're looking for studios, like listening, like taking tours and listening to what the live room sounds like could be a factor. If you're kind of vibing with something, we'll talk about vibe later more, but the live room can play a big part in what your recordings end up sounding like.
Yeah, totally.
Isolation booths tend to be kind of dead, usually.
Yep.
Because they're usually kind of small. So, but yeah, the quality spectrum that I want to talk about was like just the fact that like at this point in time, especially, like we have everything from someone's bedroom that they're like marketing themselves as a recording studio, or like a basement, or up to a multi-million-dollar facility. So there's this huge range of quality that you may encounter when you're looking for studios. Mm-hmm. And you get what you pay for a lot of times. Yeah. And just because someone has some foam on the walls doesn't make it a studio. You know, I mean, people mistake isolation, like they call their studio like soundproof or something like that, like, and because they put some foam on the walls. Well, that has nothing really to do with like being well isolated. If isolation's a factor you're looking for, like that's a much more detailed construction thing going on than just putting foam on the walls. So I would be careful of going into a space that looks kind of like rinky-dink.
Yeah.
You want to listen to what's come out of that studio carefully.
Yeah.
And I understand your budgets might be like kind of tying you to the more cheaper studios that might look a little half put together. But yeah, then it's just more important that you listen to what has come out of that studio and the engineer's work.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, going back to the engineer makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has happened with the technology is because you can run any DAW on a laptop, all of a sudden you can be a producer. I'm doing quotes around the word producer.
Right. Or engineer.
Or an engineer and...
Or mixer.
With very little experience other than you have the gear.
Yeah.
You know,
you bought some gear and it's become very affordable, relatively speaking, to where it was before. So like, yeah, there's many more people out there. Like when I was doing market research, shall we call it, in San Diego, I discovered a lot of studios.
Really?
And most of them, I think, are kind of just small little bedrooms or, garage conversions. Not really so nice or professionally done, but man, there's like 80 studios.
Holy cow. Wow.
And so you'll find people out there marketing themselves, even if they don't really have like a proper studio, but and like I said, like maybe they do great work. So listen,
Yeah.
But it's just going to be a big range that you're going to find out there. And that's just something that you need to know. Yeah, but going back to the physical space, you need to think about what you require. So I think we talked last episode about like, are you going to track like everything together or things in piecemeal? So, if your plan is to have your whole band and you have like a 9-piece band all playing at the same time, then you might need the space. You need to make sure you have a large live room or a studio with a bunch of isolation booths, something that can accommodate that. Yeah, it's big enough. Is the studio big enough for what you need to do? Take a tour, see for yourself what you're working with, and how are the sight lines? That's something that you don't think about too much, but for musicians to play with each other, it's sometimes important that they can see each other.
Totally.
So that's something to look for too. If there are isolation booths, like that's one thing about Rarefied that I wish I could have done bigger is my sound locks / isolation booths, because they're somewhat small. So if you are planning to use the isolation booths, are they big enough for the instrument that you want to put in there? Because like I can't really put like an upright bass in mine, for instance.
Yeah, right. It's a little difficult. I put acoustic guitar players in there, but they have to stand a certain way.
In a weird way.
But it works,
Yeah, it does. They work great for guitar amps and bass amps and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I've put a vocalist in there. I've put a trumpet player, saxophone player. But yeah, like a tuba player, probably not. So yeah, you have to kind of see what you're working with in a studio, what your requirements are based on the way you've decided to go about tracking, and make sure those things fit. And the size of the studio can also affect the sound, which we were kind of talking about earlier. Live rooms can have a sound, and you may be looking for that. You may be looking for a big drum sound, like a natural room sound. Like, what are some great studios you've worked at, Brian, that have that sort of thing going on?
Well, all the old famous ones, Capitol and A&M and Sunset Sound and Cello, which is now East West, the Village. I mean, they all... we would choose studios according to the band and what they require. Kind of like what you're just saying. I mean, I did a singer-songwriter guy where we used a small room, and it was perfect because we wanted a tight drum sound.
Yeah. So sometimes you want a small room.
Yeah.
You don't want the large room.
Yeah.
It just gets in the way.
And when I first started, when you were in a big room, the ISO booth was where the drums were. Because if you remember back in those days, there were dead drums.
Yeah, 70s kind of.
Well, it was the 80s,
80s even.
The early part of the 80s. And you'd put the conga player in there or whatever, but then you'd have the rest of the guys would be seated out into the room, and then you have baffles between them, that kind of setup. And then it all of a sudden changed.
Yeah.
Where the drums are in the big room.
The 90s seemed to move more towards a natural room sound, would you say?
Yeah, totally.
Bigger room. Yeah, so it depends what you're looking for. Sometimes you don't want all that room. And a lot of times they can bring gobos in close to the drums if it is a big room place.
Yeah.
And kind of tighten it up.
Yeah, I would do that a lot.
Yeah. So you can kind of make a big room turn into a small room if there's gobos or other soft things. Mm-hmm. But you can't really make a small room turn into a big room.
Yeah.
You have to just do that with reverbs and artificial room sounds, which works also. You can make that work. Yeah, if you go take a tour of the studio, I recommend in the ebook, which I forgot to mention at the top, but yeah, at preppingforthestudio.com, you can download the ebook version that this podcast is based off of. I mentioned, taking a snare drum or a floor tom with you into a space that you're touring, if this is important to you, and taking it with you and hitting it in the room, seeing what it sounds like, what's the decay like.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good idea. Mm-hmm. It's funny, when I walk into a room, I usually hear my voice in the room, and you can
just talking. Yeah,
you can hear what it's doing a little bit.
Totally. Just talking in a room can give you a sense of how it sounds and how it's going to respond to instruments. Anything else you can think of
no
rooms?
No, I keep coming the thought that we're going to talk about the experienced engineer versus there's things that keep coming into my mind about these topics we're talking about.
Like what?
Like when you walk into a live room at a place, if you hear certain slapbacks, that may not be so good.
Right. Yeah. Flutter echo is a thing. That's when you have like surfaces that cause like a fast echo that usually doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you encounter that, you might want to just run.
Yeah, so you have to kind of know what that is. If you haven't been in a studio much, you may not know, oh, that's what that is.
Yeah, you can clap your hands is another way to kind of see what the room does. I mean, anytime that you're thinking about what studio am I going to work in, like, you have to have that conversation with your engineer in mind, or with them there, or we're going to talk about it more later, but like, are you using the engineer that comes with the studio, or are you bringing in your own engineer? If you're bringing in your own engineer, they're going to want to, they might even like basically tell you like, look guys, you should use this studio. I know it sounds great. Like, you don't have to go touring a bunch of studios.
Yeah.
Like, this is the place that I like, that's going to work for your project.
Yeah, totally.
Or maybe you go together and you're kind of like checking places out, that's cool.
Yeah.
If you don't have an engineer, then, you're going to be utilizing the in-house engineer at a studio. So that's a whole other discussion that we're going to have, about how to choose an engineer. But, then there's some other important things about, well, who is this engineer and what do they like and all that. We'll get to that. But let's talk a little more about studio stuff. So let's talk about equipment and instruments, which I don't want to go too detailed, but there's things that you need to consider. Can they record enough channels at once for what you're planning to do? So going back to your recording plan, if you're planning to record a bunch of instruments at once, that can mean a lot of mics, a lot of channels that you need to record at the same time. So is the studio equipped for that? Fair question.
Yep, totally.
If you were planning to record with tape, do they have tape? Is it working? There's all the ancillary kind of equipment that would be needed to have enough headphones for you. And it kind of only matters when you have, a big ensemble you're trying to record at once. You just have to make sure that they have enough stuff. Specifically what they have, I don't want to go too down that rabbit hole. Obviously there's so many different kinds of recording equipment, different brands, and they all have subtly different sounds. Like I have a Neve console we're recording right now with a Neve preamp basically, or it is, yeah, it's a Neve console. That's one famous console and mic preamp, and then there's APIs, another famous one. They all have their different sounds,
Yeah.
And if you are savvy about that and you know about that stuff, then sure, like seek out what you're looking for, But if you don't know anything about that stuff, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would listen probably more to just what stuff sounds like coming out of that studio. If you like it, then,
Yeah.
then cool.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times if you're doing a tour of places, you'll look for quality, just, if the guy's got cables that are the mic cables going to the machine and they're just like, he's got, the wires are showing or something, you may want to think about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's just the general, like, we'll get into this about vibe, but like if you walk in and you just immediately feel uncomfortable, like this place is dirty, this place is unkempt, this is, if that's important to you, then yeah, that could be a red flag. Like something's not really going well here.
Yep.
Another thing though, before we get into that, instruments, because you might need certain instruments. You might need a piano, for instance, a real piano.
Yep.
You might need a Hammond organ. I have a Hammond organ. They're big, things that you probably don't have yourself. Even if you did, man, they're a pain to move. So you have to consider that if there's certain instruments that you were hoping to use. Maybe you were hoping to use a guitar amps of better quality than what you have. So what does the studio have? Drum kits too.
Yep.
Sometimes studios have a bunch of drum kit options or snare drums or something like that. That's awesome. So yeah, think about that. Oh, you mentioned this. Chambers and plates.
Yes.
It's another thing you're not going to be able to do yourself, like an echo chamber, if that's important to you. Like Capitol has amazing ones, right? I do not have a chamber here, but I do have a real plate reverb. Those are basically just giant pieces of metal in a box. That's one old school kind of way of doing a reverb, is send your signal through this big piece of metal and get the vibrations coming off of it. They just take up a lot of real estate. Like you're not going to have one at home.
Yeah.
There's of course great emulations of these things, but if you were looking to like get some real deal stuff, you could, seek that out. So yeah, that's kind of the equipment and instrument side of things to consider.
Yep.
And then, yeah, let's talk about vibe, because vibe's important. It's a word that gets used a lot.
Oh, yeah. It's important.
I think we all know what it means. I mean, just the feel of a place, feel of anything.
Yeah.
And like I was saying, like when you walk into the studio, do you feel comfortable? Is it as clean as you'd like it to be, if that matters to you? Do they have weird art on the walls? Like, does it gel? Like I try to keep this place kind of neutral, rarefied.
Yeah.
Instead of like, I could have put up some interesting art, but I didn't want to like stamp too hard of like one particular thing onto the studio.
Sure. Yeah.
But there's still a vibe.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a 70s. I was going to say retro modern, but no, mid-century modern. That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of the vibe over here.
That makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of reds and oranges and browns and autumnal colors.
Yeah.
Kind of, to me, it's like creates kind of a warm, inviting space.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, and House of Blues has a studio up in LA, and it's totally like the House of Blues. That sort of old art. Lots of brilliant colors in the art.
Yeah.
Old wood.
Right. And that probably is really cool. I mean, to some people, at least.
Totally.
So does it gel with you, is the question. Does it inspire you, the studio? Or I've seen some studios that honestly, like, they feel like office, like a dentist's office or something like that. Like, that's, to me, very uninspiring.
Yeah.
And doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you want to check it out. You want to make sure it feels right for you. You feel comfortable, relaxed. You feel inspired, creative in that space. Think about the lighting too. Lighting's huge for me. Like all my lights can be dimmed. They're very yellow. Like I hate that like really harsh fluorescent.
Oh yeah.
Lighting.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
Yeah. in some places, people don't really care about that stuff. So the studio owner might just be like, yeah, we're putting in LEDs. They're super efficient. You know, it's like, yeah, awesome. But it looks terrible.
Yeah.
Is there a lounge? What's the lounge like?
Yep.
Do they provide you any amenities? Coffee, tea, water?
Yep.
How's the bathroom?
Yeah. It's important.
Yeah. Is there a policy about smoking and drinking? Is that important to you? Some people really want to smoke
Yep.
in their session. I have kind of a hard no about that here. So that can sometimes become a problem.
Yeah. Most places do, I think.
Yeah.
Except maybe a home type
Right.
places, you know.
Yeah. I've seen some places that are cool with it, smoking weed in the control room and the live room and all that, you know, and that might be important to some people.
Yep.
But it's often a no.
Yeah.
Because it smells and the particulates come out of the smoke and land on the gear and get in the pots, and then everything gets scratchy. And that's why I say no. It's the smell and it's the stuff that settles down into the potentiometers of the gear and makes everything. It's not worth it to me.
Yep. Yeah.
Are there going to be interns or runners hanging around? What's the good and bad about that, Brian?
Well, the good is you have help. And, you have somebody that can even make you a cup of coffee if you want a coffee. But the biggest thing is like, bringing your drums in or helping you set up, also helping the engineer and the producer if they are running behind with setting up microphones or patching gear. I mean, they're basically there to do anything.
Yeah.
The bad part about it is you want to make sure that the personality matches with the session, and they help it run smooth rather than add some difficulties
or even just being that extra person in the room that you don't know.
Yeah.
That you might be like, well, who's that?
And they're staring at you while you're playing your guitar part.
Yeah. Because you might know the engineer and you probably would know everyone else in your band or whatever. But then there's this like other random person and you're like, who's this? Like, I don't like them.
Yeah.
It can happen.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
They have to be a good vibe. There's that word.
Yeah.
Vibe.
Yeah. It is super important.
Yeah.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Rarefied Recording. Oh, that's me. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my studio, Rarefied Recording, and the services I offer there. The studio itself was built from the ground up, from the masterful plans of Mr. Wes Lachaux, so it sounds fantastic both in the control room and the live room. A 32-channel Neve Genesis console holds center court and is complemented by a wide array of outboard gear, instruments, and microphones. Your music will be in good company. If you live in the San Diego area, just head on over to rarefiedrecording.com to learn more and book a tour. You can also hear examples of my tracking and mixing work. If you aren't lucky enough to live in San Diego, let me be the first to suggest the idea of a destination recording experience. San Diego is BBB approved. The Better Business Bureau? No, beaches, burritos, and beer. Even if you're not a beach person, who's to complain with temperatures that are very often in the 70s? Even the winter months are averaging in the mid-60s. And being relatively dry, rain is unlikely to get in your way. The studio is very centrally located, and you can get to just about anywhere in the area in 15 to 20 minutes, even Mexico. And while burritos are technically not a food you find in Mexico itself, San Diego has taken the concept to blissful culinary heights. You can't go hardly 100 yards here without running into a little taco shop that will be 10 times better than whatever options you have in your town. If Mexican isn't your thing, no worries. There are tons of great restaurants in the area, including a barbecue place 3 blocks away that rivals anything I've tried in Texas. And adjacent to it is one of over 150 craft breweries in San Diego. If you love beer, we gotcha. The West Coast IPA style is a specialty here, but we've got brewers doing all kinds of beers, and several have tasting rooms in walking distance. Did I mention that accommodations are available? So head on over to rarefiedrecording.com and reach out for a quote today. That's RAREFIED recording.com. And now back to the episode. Location is also important. I mean, if you're staying local, what's the commute going to be like for you? Mm-hmm. What's the neighborhood like? Do you feel safe there?
Restaurants.
Yeah. Is there any good place to eat? Obviously now we can all order food from our phones, which makes it easier. But you might want to get out and walk around and go to a local restaurant. Mm-hmm. So what's available? Are you in the middle of nowhere? Is there options?
Yep.
What's the parking situation?
Yeah.
I know that can be a real buzzkill for certain places like San Francisco.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I've heard about that. Like the studio didn't make it because the parking sucked.
Oh man, that would.
Because parking is so terrible in some cities.
Yeah.
And everyone's just thinking to themselves, well, like, yeah, I don't want to go there because where would I park?
That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, parking in the load in, load out situation.
Yep. That's where the helper will help. Loading in, loading out.
Now you may be thinking of going out of town to record, which is cool because you get out of your home space, you get focused, nothing distracting you. But what is the lodging situation? Is there some options for you? Sometimes the studios have on-site lodging, which can be nice.
Yeah.
Possibly cheaper. Unless you want to like get away, But yeah, those are things to think about.
Yep.
I think that's kind of like the physical stuff that I want to talk about. Can you think of anything?
Gosh, no. Okay. I mean,
yeah, I think we should move on to talking about the tracking engineer.
Yep.
We'll get into mixing at a later time and mastering, but we're still kind of in the tracking phase here. So
yeah,
how do you pick one? How do you find one? How do you pick one? Because again, man, engineer matters a lot, probably more than the studio.
Yeah. Which is funny because I don't think people actually understand that.
Yeah.
Joe down the street, he plays, he does audio.
Yeah. No, I mean, you want both, but yeah, the engineer, like we said, I'm sure if I gave you an SM57 in someone's practice space, you could outperform a lot of engineers in this place or some other $1 million facility or something. We also must talk about, whether you're using a producer or not, because if you're using a producer, they may be a producer engineer.
Yep.
Playing both roles. Now, from your experience, what's kind of like the pros and cons of that, Brian?
Well, it's always good to have a guy do his task, one task, and that's the engineer do the engineer, and the producer does the production. And the producer can be working with the band, whereas the engineer is busy. He's got a lot to do. He's got to get headphones going. He's got to make sure everything's working. He's got to make sure that mic hasn't been knocked over and does it sound right.
Yeah.
Whereas an artist might be coming in who's not being recorded yet, or he's not getting sounds on that guy, and he wants to ask questions about the structure of the song.
Right.
So the producer, if he's perfect, that's perfect. That's his gig.
Yeah.
Where if you're the engineer, it's going to take longer, and also you'll have to understand this guy's got a lot going on.
Or gal. Leave out the women.
That's right. And they could be perfect at it. There's a lot of engineer producers that are awesome, and they've been doing it for a long time. For me, I mean, I like to really focus on what I'm doing, and then the production is. I'll do that too, but I have to really focus on one thing, and then I like to jump over to the other thing. So it might take a little longer for someone.
Yeah, there's a switching back and forth that has to happen when you're playing both roles as producer engineer. You have to be able to jump between the technical side of like, okay, am I getting signal? Does it sound good? Is there anything weird about it? Any weird noises? Like, that part of it versus is this the right performance? Is this the right part? Like, what's going on with the music side of it?
Yeah.
There's this like switching that you have to do in your brain. They're pretty different.
Yeah.
They're related, obviously, but they're different. And so it's hard. It's kind of hard to do. And some people have mastered it.
Yeah. I find that there are a lot of people who can do it and do it really well, but I also find that there's a lot of people who do it, but then neither one is excellent as it could be because they're time's going back and forth.
Totally.
So they're not getting 100% on either.
Yeah. And when you can separate it, then you are able to do 100%. You have someone dedicated to the big picture stuff, the producer would be, and the engineer dedicated to the minutia of what I'm recording right now, and is there any issues with it? Does it sound good? And the producer obviously has input on how it sounds also, but...
And it's great because it frees him up to sit back and listen. He doesn't have to pay attention to the kick drum if it's the mic's touching the head or something. He can sit back and listen to the song and the tempo and the key. Did somebody make any That's all he has to worry about,
Yeah. Now, it's probably going to be cheaper to have one person play both roles. Let's face it. You're hiring only one person.
Yep.
So a lot of times if you are having a producer involved, it ends up being just cheaper route to have them engineer as well.
Yep.
If you can afford to have both, I think it's the better way, generally speaking. The one thing I will say is that when a producer is the engineer, they may be able to more quickly get to where they want because their hands are directly on the equipment. Instead of like trying to translate what's in their head if they have a sound.
Yes, definitely.
To the engineer who's then like, okay, unless they've worked together a lot.
Yeah.
Which sometimes is the case where they kind of know each other.
Yeah.
They know what each other like. There could be an argument to say like the producer engineer could more quickly get to the thing that they want because they're directly moving the mic, twiddling the knob, etc.
Yep, true.
But it may also not be the case because they're going back and forth between two different things constantly and it's taking them longer.
Yeah, that's the other thing. You want to make sure that the relationship between the producer and the engineer is good because they're going to be working together.
Yes.
Can be sonic or it could be, sonic is probably the biggest thing that would be going on between an engineer and a producer.
Now, let's say you're not using a producer. So then your options typically are either hire an independent engineer or use the one attached to a studio. So let's say you're seeking out an independent engineer. How do you find one? How do you pick one? So I guess number one would be, as far as, looking for someone who has done something that you like, right?
Yeah.
Obvious, I guess. It's harder to do now because credits aren't as readily available as they were before. You look at the liner notes of a record that you admired and like, oh, you almost always would say who the engineer was. And now if you're on Spotify, I mean, I don't think they list that stuff at all.
No.
And Tidal does sometimes.
Tidal, yeah.
I'm on Tidal, so I look for it sometimes.
Yep.
A lot of times, no.
I don't see it on Apple Music either.
Yeah. So then you got to go dig and try to do some research online. Still, you may never find that out.
Some really big records I've looked up, but I can't find who worked on it.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
But, the other way is, I think the one way I find people find you is through word of mouth.
Yes.
Like bands are backstage after, hanging out or whatever.
Totally.
Oh, who did your record?
Yeah. And Joe Schmo, he's actually here. Yeah. Totally. Word of mouth is huge. Ask your friends who are in bands who they work with, who they like. That's huge.
Yeah.
You can also do an internet search and you could go on social media. You could look for hashtags like hashtag audio engineer. You might find some people local to you. Yeah. But you have to then vet these people.
Yeah, totally.
You have to see who they are, what they're really like as a person. Because you might be spending a lot of time with them.
Yeah.
So their personality matters. And their way they communicate matters.
Yep.
So you have to, meet with them probably. Talk with them, whatever. Zoom with them. I don't know.
Yeah.
Somehow you have to evaluate who they are as a person and make sure that they're a good fit for you.
Yeah. And talk about music or interests or whatever. See how it gels.
Yeah. Do they seem excited about your music? Or are they just like, okay, I guess I'll do it. Let me see.
Yeah. That's a good thing to mention is have something they can hear.
Yeah.
Or have them come to your show or, well, if there are shows happening. But, it's important for them to know what you're doing as you are them. Because you've researched them, but they don't know anything about you. So
possibly, yeah.
Maybe.
So, sending them your previous releases or demos would be a good idea.
Yeah.
For sure. If you have a show, they can come check out, and that shows their level of interest too if they show up.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Okay. So let's say it's the other situation where you don't have an engineer. You're not going to use an independent engineer. You're going to use one attached to the studio. It's still the same kind of situation because you want to make sure they're a good fit for you. Musically, personally, etc. Like all the same stuff applies. Studio might be awesome, but the engineer that you're going to be stuck with might suck.
Right.
As a person or whatever. So that can be a deciding factor.
Yeah. Still important to meet them and just shoot the with them.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Now, I mean, the good thing about working with the in-house engineers is that they're very familiar with the studio.
Yeah.
And the rooms and the sound, and they're probably going to be cheaper because it's probably like a package deal.
Mm-hmm.
Versus when you have an outside engineer who's coming to a studio that they're not familiar with, there's a learning curve. There's time spent like, oh wait, how's this patch bay working? How's this console working? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Depends on the the engineer and their experience level. But you could have some wasted time. You could have possibly some less than optimal decisions made on where to put the drums, or things like that can happen.
Yeah, totally.
And if you're using the in-house engineer, you're more likely to quickly kind of get to a better place.
Yeah. I almost always, whenever I go into a room I haven't worked at, I say, well, where do most guys put the drums, or what's the hot spot in the room? I ask questions and try to figure it out. So I'm not.
Right. Is there anything I should know? Is there any channels on the board that don't work? Or
yeah.
Someone who works there all the time will know all the little weird things. Like, oh, yeah, this channel doesn't work. Or you can use this, but you have to know that it's, you got to hit it and move the dial, or it's because it's noisy otherwise.
Is one 1176 better than the other?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's all that. When you're going the route of the producer engineer or independent engineer, you want to have this decision of what studio to use closely tied with them. I think we mentioned that already. Mm-hmm. Anyways, I was going to also say, if you don't have a producer, good to know that your engineer becomes a de facto producer, essentially.
Yeah.
Or someone in the band, yourself maybe. But often the engineer, because no one else is like telling them good, bad, change this, change that. It's just their decisions, every little micro decision they make of where to place a mic, which mic, how to EQ it, how much to compress it or not. Like, they're basically the producer.
Yeah. And they're paying attention when you're playing the song. They're or they should be paying attention. They're listening to the song go down.
Yeah. This can be a good thing. I mean, if the engineer's good. But it's also sometimes engineers might get a little too into this role more than you want. I mean, this is a discussion that you should have, I guess.
Yeah.
If you don't have a producer, is how much input do you want from this engineer that's working for you? Do you want them to like tell you what they think?
Yeah.
Or you want them to just do their job as far as, putting mics up, getting sounds, recording, hitting record.
A soundboard. How was that? Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Like, what do you want? It's a discussion that you should have, because you could maybe be expecting to get feedback and the engineer's giving you nothing. And you're like, well, man, this guy's kind of lame.
Yeah.
Or you could be getting way too much.
Yeah.
And be like, dude, I don't care about what you think. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's important to know. I know. And there are a lot of guys who tend to go too far. And it's not appropriate.
Sometimes it's not what you're looking for. So you have to know that going in and have that discussion. But sometimes engineers who you didn't hire as a producer end up stepping up into a producer kind of role, because you said, I'd love to have your opinion, or you start asking them a bunch of questions and they're telling you what they think. There can become a point at which you've essentially unintentionally turned your engineer into a producer, like legit producer. Like, totally. Like they're like really stepped up. And if this does happen to you, please consider giving them some sort of credit, at least, if not maybe some extra money. Just saying,
a little compensation,
because now they've gone above and beyond. The least you can do is now give them the credit as producer.
Yeah, and shout outs and thank yous, all that goes a long way. Yeah, it's funny when, after doing a lot of work and everybody just kind of leaves, and if you don't get a thank you or, man, great job, thank you so much. If you don't get that, it's kind of like, okay. Yeah,
you're not going to work as hard next time, maybe.
It's definitely a bummer. Everybody wants to be appreciated. And I think, that's what I'm doing on the other side of the glass when I'm getting sounds and all that. I say, hey, man, it sounds great. your guitar sounds like, you know what, you might need to fix that. Oh, it's great now.
You're trying to give people that positive feedback.
Totally.
So it's nice when it goes both ways. And if you're a musician, it's gonna help you out because you give that kind of positive feedback, and then the engineer is more invested in your project.
Yeah. It's also good for the musicians to talk to the engineer when they're out and they say something like, "Oh man, the headphones sound great." Because a lot of times you can play badly because your headphones aren't balanced right. And right now I've got headphones on with this little mixer box. And some guys, I've gone to listen to their headphones when the music's playing back and the mix is so bad, I have no idea how they're performing.
Yes.
So it makes a big difference.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, give your engineers props, especially if they step it up into all the way to a producer type of role. Because that can be a very good thing, unless you don't want it, in which case you should talk about it and you should let them know, hey man, I don't really need your comments about this or that. Just
yeah, the keyboard's going to be coming in with lots of comments. We don't need more.
Yeah. Okay, so that's all that. Now we should talk a bit about budget. Unfortunately, you have to think about it. You only have so much money for this thing. One thing that can be tricky, as you're going through this whole thing is, well, how long is this tracking stuff going to take? Because, the number of hours that you book just adds up, right? To your final bill. As far as just the tracking part, we're only talking about tracking so far too.
Yeah, right.
There's still going to be mixing and mastering. You have to have the big picture in mind. And there's going to be, are you making physical copies? Are you promoting this thing that you just spent all this money on?
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Right.
But estimating the amount of time you're going to need is something you can get help with usually from the producer or engineer, because they're probably more experienced in how long this stuff takes.
Yeah.
So you can just talk with them and be like, hey, this is our goal. Our goal is to record this many songs, and this is our instrumentation. What do you think? How many hours are we talking about? They can give you an idea.
Yeah.
But you have to also understand, are we being charged by the hour? Are we being charged by the day or by the song? Sometimes it's one or the other, I usually just do my tracking sessions by hour because I don't like quoting people per song, for instance, because I don't really know how long it's going to take to do a particular song.
Yep.
And a lot of it has to do with how well you can perform.
Yes. Yep.
And you can't forget that.
That's right.
So if there's people in the band that are going to be struggling, you might want to budget a little extra from what the engineer is estimating for you, because it could just take longer.
Yeah, that's true. And there also could be technical things like, you might have to do lots of edits to help correct a musician.
Yes, totally. But yeah, and then, like I said, there's this big picture of not just recording, but mixing, mastering, promotion, physical copies, music videos, etc. You need to kind of figure all that out.
Yeah.
And make sure the tracking part isn't blowing your budget.
Yeah.
Leaving you I can't afford to do this or that and the other thing. Now, if your budget is very constrained, let's talk a minute about where you might want to put your money. Because you can still do something in the studio and up the quality of your recording. So to me, if we're thinking about recording, the recording side of things, if your budget is constrained, I would probably do drums. If you have drums to record. Yeah. Because they're hard to record, they're loud. It's hard to do at home,
Yeah.
The experience, the number of mics you need,
Him being able to hear well.
Yeah. The sound of the room.
Yeah.
Because when you're in a usual apartment or even a lot of houses, the ceilings are pretty low. You get some pretty strong reflections in your overheads. Yeah. Drums would be something that I would go to a studio for if your budget is limited and you're looking, well, I want to do something to make this recording better than what I can just do on my own.
Yep. I agree.
Yeah. Close second. What do you think?
Well, I know you mentioned something else. I would say vocals.
Yes.
I like vocals in a studio.
Yes.
I like everything in a studio, but if you're really on that budget and you have to pick a couple of things, it would be drums and vocals.
Why vocals?
Main vocal. Just because you have, hopefully, if you go to the studio that you want, you'll have a better selection of microphones, better selection of compressors and mic pre's. You'll have options. Whereas at home, you go, oh, this is my vocal mic. This is what it runs through, the Focusrite. goes into the USB that goes into my Logic.
Yeah.
Whereas you go to a studio, you've got you've got an SM7 or you've got a 67 Neumann.
Yeah.
And you can go into an 1176 through a Neve, and I mean
some nice gear, basically. If you don't know what those things are.
And I think also it takes the person away from the home environment and makes it feel a little more like they got to step up a bit. It's more professional.
Yeah.
Great headphones. You've got your own room. You can turn the lights down.
The room sounds good.
Yeah, and you've got a nice mix on your headset.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would make sense. Vocals. Guitars, that would typically be something you could probably do at home.
Mm-hmm.
And bass too, you can do bass direct. I mean, always studio is best. But drums and vocals, that makes sense. Now the other thing would be, we were talking earlier about mixing. Maybe save some of your money to hire a mixer instead of doing that yourself, because that can really make a huge difference. It's the 10,000 hour thing or whatever, it's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
That if you don't really know what you're doing, you're just not going to get the same results as someone who does. And maybe you have had to record a lot of it yourself, but a good mixer will be able to pull out some things from only semi-decent recording. They'll be able to EQ it better, compress it better.
But I know one thing that I would do is if you've been working on your songs at home by yourself, doing the guitars or whatever you're doing there, you're probably taking out rough mixes with you to your car, to your earbuds, and make sure if you're hiring a mix guy, you let him hear that, because you're going to be very attached to that. Mm-hmm. And if that's what you really love, I mean, you may want to just say, do your thing, let's hear it. But 80% of the time, you're going to have things on that track that you did that you really like. It might be a reverb. It might be some delay you did.
Yeah.
I know what I was going to say is that it's really common for people to blow their money in the tracking and the overdub phase, and then it comes to mix time and they have only so much money for a mixer,
right,
and then very little for the mastering. Like sometimes they'll say, well, can you master it too?
Yeah.
And you don't want to have to do that. You want to get the best quality of all the different
ideally
areas,
yes,
if you possibly can. Even if it takes time. Sometimes it's good to take time between the tracking and the mixing.
Or do fewer songs.
That's a good point too.
Do you really need to do the full length?
Yeah.
Maybe you do the EP, or maybe you just do a couple singles, because in this day and age, singles are kind of back. So yeah, maybe you just have to pare it back from the full length.
That's a good idea.
But I would say, as far as like spending a lot of money on mixing versus mastering, I would push it more towards mixing.
Yep, I would too.
Mastering is the cherry on top, and you can't expect to send a mastering engineer a mediocre mix and for it to suddenly become an amazing mix. Mm-hmm. It's just not going to happen.
Yep.
It's going to be a little better, hopefully, but it's not going to suddenly become this other thing. You don't want to like go too cheap on the mastering and use like your friend down the street who doesn't really know what he's doing.
Right. Slapping a plug-in on it.
Yeah, just slapping ozone on it and using a preset. Like, well, you can do that at home and maybe it's okay. And there's also a lot of, automated mastering things. What's it called?
Landor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's better than like your friend down the street, because there's some sort of thought that's gone into Lander. Yeah. But yeah, I would push more towards spending your money on mixing versus over mastering.
Yeah. Can I tell you one of my pet peeves?
Yes.
Is when I'm tracking or working on a project and the money's starting to run out. Fine, no problem.
Yeah.
But then I find out that they're doing a photo shoot somewhere and they're paying like $2,000 for something and the music's not done.
Yeah.
The music to me is the most important part. Your visuals and all that is important too, but let's focus on one thing and get it the best it can be before you start to do the next. It's just one of my pet peeves.
Yeah. Or you were saying sometimes with the mastering, like you find out that they ended up sending it to like a really expensive mastering engineer while at the same time giving you lots of flack about spending too much on you as a mixing engineer.
They cut your price so low, and then you find out they're using Bob Ludwig, who's like $500 an hour, and you're like, what?
Yeah, you guys got it wrong there. Like we were saying, it's put more of your money into mixing than mastering. But tracking is important too, because if you start with crap, you're kind of going to end with crap.
Well, it's really hard to mix stuff that's bad. And, it takes a lot. That's one of the things I would say is because I mix a lot, I get a lot of vocals that were done at home. Mm-hmm. And there's just so many problems. And a lot of times there's this high end at the top that they can't really hear because they're in the bedroom or a closet.
Yeah. Just a noise or something in sibilant or something.
Yeah, like noises or rumbles. Yeah. Which, you can fix. But
you can take out a lot of these things now, but
then there's no like vibe to it. No warmth. It's pinched and smallish.
Yeah.
And you can't. It's really hard to make that big again.
Yeah, and the vocal is super important, as we've talked about.
Yeah, you can't sample the vocal. You can take a kick drum and put a sample on it. You can't do that to a vocal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Drums and vocals. When the drums suck in a recording, to me, it's like the whole thing is ruined.
Yeah, it's hard.
Even if like the guitars are awesome or something, it's like if the drums sound crappy, like I just find the whole thing sounds crappy.
Yeah. That's the foundation,
Yeah.
It's a beat and a vocal.
Yeah. It's weird. Drums and vocals.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's about all I think we want to talk about today.
Cool.
On episode 4, Prepping for the Studio. Thanks again for listening. Please subscribe. Yeah. Send us comments, questions, etc. And tell your friends.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear feedback just to,
Yes, we're very open to that.
Yeah.
And we can address them on the podcast or in an email back or whatever. So head on over to preppingforthestudio.com and send us a message.
Right on.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
That's our show for today, folks. Thanks so much for listening to Prepping for the Studio. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to your podcast from. And don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends. Episode info and my ebook, A Musician's Guide to the Recording Studio, are available at preppingforthestudio.com. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out there. Prepping for the Studio was recorded and edited at Rarefied Recording by me, Roy Silverstein. Theme music written by myself and Ariel Levine. Performed and recorded by Ariel Levine. Many thanks to my co-host Brian Schubel and you. Best of luck to you and your musical endeavors. And remember, as Alexander Graham Bell once said, before anything else, preparation is the key to success. We'll see you next time.